Hello and welcome back to our Health Cog Extra. What's next for the National Health Service? We have had quite a morning. I'm Tabitha Goldstall, the co-founder of CogX, and I'm thrilled to welcome you back wherever you are today. Don't forget, as well as listening to our speakers, you can check out the expo and drop a line to some of the brilliant organizations showcasing their innovations there. Next, I am very excited to introduce a pioneer of medicine, Eric Topol. Eric is the founder and director of Scripps Research Translational Institute and the professor of modular medicine and the executive price of Scripps Research. This man is the man that when you talk about health, everybody wants to listen. And here today we have to interview him, Eleanor Harwich, one of my dearest friends, who's also the director of research for the think tank Reform. Eleanor, over to you.
Welcome to this Fireside chat. I'm really excited to be chairing this session today, as I've admired Dr. Eric Topol's work for a very long time, and I'm thrilled to have the opportunity to ask him questions. Eric is a cardiologist, a geneticist, and an expert in digital medicine. He is also the founder and director of the Scripps Research Translational Institute, a professor of molecular medicine at the Scripps Research Institute, and a senior consultant at the Division of Cardiovascular Disease at the Scripps Clinic in La Jolla in California. He has also authored several best-selling books, which I highly recommend for you to read, and wears many other hats like being editor-in-chief of Medscape, which is a medical news outlet. Closer to home in the UK, Eric was commissioned by the Secretary of State for Health to conduct a review into how to prepare the healthcare workforce to deliver a digital future. That review was published in 2019 and is known as the Topol Review. Also, absolutely great document that I cannot recommend enough for you to read. And I'm thrilled to be discussing with him today what the current pandemic has revealed in terms of the strengths and weaknesses of healthcare systems around the world, as well as the lessons that we should be taking from this crisis. So the impact of the pandemic has obviously varied from country to country, but in your view, Eric, are there any commonalities in the weaknesses that it has revealed about healthcare systems?
Yes, well, it's great to be with you. Let me say for sure, this has been an acid test for all the countries around the world. Can they rise to the pandemic challenge? And what we've seen is where there is not universal health care, like in the United States, we have fared particularly poorly. The people who are not having their care, they can easily access it or are afraid to get care because of the tremendous costs that can be involved. These are the people that have borne the biggest brunt, although overall there has been as you well know, in the United States, an exaggerated, poor outcome. Many countries have done exceptionally well in handling the pandemic, but it's still not over. We're seeing, the rebound, the surges in cases, even some of the countries that performed admirably in the first wave. So this is a challenge that's a century plus in terms of something that even compares with it. It's really a tough test.
Yes, definitely. And do you think that there are potentially, I guess, kind of any key ingredients maybe of having very strict lockdowns, having a kind of, increased testing capacity? What are the things that really kind of allow countries to be able to, somewhat control the situation?
Right. Well, there's many elements, if you look at the common threads of the most successful countries that come together. One is for sure consistent communication to the public, leading with the science. That has worked really well. That is the modeling and importance of masks and the physical distancing. So that starts with the science as long as it's driving it. The uniformity or solidarity among the public to follow that message. To wear masks, to distance, to do all the things that we know will help that are not relying on a vaccine or a drug that we don't have yet. These are vital. So, I think that is a common thread that you'll see across all the countries that include having aggressive testing. In some countries done even before the first patient was diagnosed in their country to get ahead of it. So staying ahead of the pandemic, leading with the science, communication, these are some of the most important elements that have had proven success.
And so one of the topics that has become quite in vogue, I think, in the face of this pandemic is also understanding what I guess, factors contribute to the resilience of the healthcare system, which, can go beyond just the management of this pandemic, but something, in the long term that allows you to absorb shocks when there's a massive change in the nature of demand for healthcare. What, in your view, are those kind of, important factors that can help you build the resilience of the healthcare system?
Well, when you have, as I learned, the system in the UK where it's egalitarian, and everyone as a human right, as a citizen has health care, that's a good start for sure. And, I think that the problems that have been experienced otherwise in the UK and other countries in Europe, like Spain and Italy and France and Belgium, some of this was just that some of the other matters weren't attended to. I think having testing, having the wherewithal to call for the lockdown early, the issues about travel and border protection and all the things that could be done, they're always easier to identify in retrospect, of course.
Yeah.
I think the point is that we've got a long ways to go in this pandemic. So hopefully we can learn from the mistakes and from other countries. That's another thing that here in the U.S., the problem has been we don't learn from ourselves or other countries. So it's a big issue.
Yeah. And actually following on from that sort of question around resilience, what do you think the kind of role of technology really is to be able to kind of help with these situations?
Well, what's really interesting is that the testing part gets overemphasis and the lack of using digital tools doesn't get enough. So you can't test everybody every day. And testing has its issues with respect to its accuracy. So if you use digital surveillance, like we advocate, and we have a big program called Detect here in the US, whereby you capture data from a smartwatch or a fitness band for resting heart rate, sleep, and physical activity steps. And that triad of markers can be analyzed to detect in a given region, a cluster, whether there's a group of people that have this elevated heart rate, more sleep, less physical activity, which is very good signal for an infection, especially when there's not a concomitant flu. So we're using that. We validated that as a very good signal. We used it. We published that on flu. We've now soon to be publishing that on COVID-19. And what's nice about that and distinctive from testing is it provides continuous surveillance. And it's basically free because people are wearing these fitness bands. And in Germany, they have over 600 or 700,000 people that are contributing their data continuously. So they have what they call the national fever curve, where they actually can pick up a cluster anywhere in the country because they have the whole country covered so well. So that's the idea. We should all be doing that. Ideally, that uses advanced analytics and it's continuous and it's low expense. Other things like wastewater management for COVID-19 should be implemented. So we can do so much better than we're doing right now to stay ahead of the outbreaks.
Do you mind me just asking, if you don't mind developing a bit that point on wastewater management? What do you mean, as in like actually genuinely testing the waters to understand basically what's happening in the spread of the infection?
Exactly. So what we've seen, just a few days ago, Yale published their Nature Medicine paper, which validated that the COVID-19 concentrations in the wastewater were tracking exactly with infections and hospitalizations in that community. And we've seen, for example, a University of Arizona that monitored wastewater in that municipality block an outbreak because they saw that the concentrations of COVID-19 in that wastewater were going up, and they were alerted that this was an emerging outbreak. In some states in the US, like Utah, they've been doing this for months. And so we know that this is a great, inexpensive way to be cognizant that an outbreak is developing before it gets to a large extent. And it's something that should be done everywhere. It's so easy, and we have really good validation now.
That's really interesting. So actually, when you kind of looked at during the lockdown period in the UK and really kind of talked to health practitioners around, the kind of implementation of digital health. There was this kind of very strange, paradoxical, almost sense of excitement that things were getting done, because obviously now there was an absolute imperative to do so. And obviously projects involving digital health, which generally, took quite a lot of time to implement, were finally being implemented. What your kind of general assessment of the use of technology during this pandemic has been? Do you think that technology has overall kind of delivered on its promises and really kind of come to the rescue, or it's just still the kind of pockets of good innovation here and there, but still kind of difficulties in understanding how to really scale a lot of this kind of good innovation?
Well, I do think, their technologies have been a disappointment. The main one is the rapid home test that should be available by now. We should be able to determine in 20 minutes whether somebody is infectious, not if they're infected, because they can have, just a minimal number of copies of virus. But if they're infectious, they have a high viral load and they can transmit to others. So if we could do that every day, whether it's children going to school or us going to work or going out anywhere, at airports, that this should be done. It's an inexpensive test. It's just like a pregnancy test. It can be done on a paper strip, so-called lateral flow antigen test, or other ways. But we should have these by now. They should be available everywhere around the world, because that is an innovation that we know would help us to get back to some semblance of pre-COVID life. For the countries, the unfortunate places which have not been able to nearly eradicate the virus, which is really hard. There are other technologies, like, for example, why doesn't everyone have an N95 mask, or at least a surgical mask that's given to them by the government to their household and renewed on a frequent basis? Why don't we do things that give everyone more protection? And, then there's the drugs. We don't have, the UK has really led the way with recovery, the trial, to nail down dexamethasone benefit. But there are other drugs that are repurposed, or even the very powerful, potent neutralizing antibodies that we don't have the trials done yet. And there's a lot of chaotic, non-randomized, there's lots of biotech out there, another form of tech, which we haven't moved as ideally quickly with, to get us therapies that could be life-saving or preventative.
Yeah. And actually, that's something that I'd kind of like to touch on, which is, obviously we have the brightest minds, as you said, across the world, really kind of working full steam ahead, trying to find a vaccine. However, the realities of drug development are, I guess, a slightly bleak prospect to think about in this times. It takes about an average of 10 years to get a drug to market, and about $1 billion will be spent in the development process. So are you generally, I guess, kind of encouraged by the research that you see that is currently happening around the world in vaccine development, or are there, I guess, any alarm bells that are kind of ringing about things that might not be done in the best way?
Well, the vaccine trials are exemplary in the speed. So firstly, there was to get the vaccines that had good potential for stimulating the immune system of people safely and effectively. They're getting high levels of neutralizing antibodies, and as potentially a bonus factor to get T cells that also were stimulated. So we saw a really quick development of the vaccines, and then safety in early studies to make sure they were good to go into these large trials. And now we have multiple trials of at least 30,000 participants getting either a placebo or the active vaccine and around the world. And there'll be many more to come. So the vaccine trials have moved at a speed which is unparalleled in clinical research ever. And that means many steps had to be taken, not just that the trial started, but they, had to develop the vaccine and get the early phase testing and everything else. And so this is, a new model, and it's rising to the occasion. The trials themselves may have some issues, but at least they're ongoing, and, in the months ahead, we'll have the answer.
So that's really interesting, because obviously, as we have had to trial a kind of new model to do research and innovation, and many countries around the world have made changes to their regulatory frameworks to be able to accelerate this innovation, do you think that there are lessons that we could take for the future in terms of potentially slightly changing the model of drug development, or are there any things that we would want to keep from this pandemic in terms of research and innovation?
Well, there are. The speed, as you've already alluded to, in life science and medicine, things often move very slow. And just think that if you had a disease and you suffered or died from it when, later, not so long later, there was a cure or a really effective treatment and you wouldn't have died or suffered. So that's why we'd like to see things moving fast. And what we have seen now is kind of like a new pandemic speed we've never seen before.
Yeah.
And it's great, but it isn't equally evident. Like I mentioned, the rapid testing isn't there yet. And some of the repurposed drugs have been studied, but many haven't yet been studied. So, it isn't evenly manifest, but at least we're seeing that. The other thing that we're seeing, which is pretty striking, is how the top tier journals around the world have risen to the occasion and publishing at a pace that we've never seen before. So getting the peer review process and also preprint these publications that have often vital information out there. Now, there's a two-edged sword there. That high velocity of getting the papers of the evidence out there is great, but it also can be a problem if the wrong, faulty evidence gets out there, right? Or the data so we've seen a little bit of the latter too. But overall, you have to give credit. The leading journals of the world in biomedicine, including Science and Nature and Cell and New England Journal of Medicine, JAMA, so many, they have really done a phenomenal job of getting the word out.
Mm. And what do you think might be the role of transparency potentially in kind of mitigating against those issues around, obviously if you need to publish at speed, you might make some mistakes along the way, and that's in a way kind of a human error and completely normal and expected. But do you think that enough is being done around transparency and being able to kind of, share the data behind the research, how the methods were developed and all of those things?
Well, there's definitely a trend towards improved transparency. And that's why I activated in recent weeks, because the vaccine companies, with their tens of thousands of participants, nearing completing enrollment, maybe not completion of the trial, they were not forthcoming in releasing their protocols, their data analysis plans, all the critical details to assess whether these trials were doing things right. And fortunately, the three leading companies, Pfizer, Moderna, AstraZeneca, within a matter of days after persistent pressure, moved into the transparent mode and released their protocols, which is great. I mean, we need more of that, and they didn't release everything in terms of other parts of their programs, but at least we have a better read on what's going on behind the curtain.
So the $1 million question for you here is, when do you think the vaccine is going to come? If you could.
Yeah, I have high confidence that there will be effective vaccines, but I don't want to see the rush. I want to see these trials go to completion. That is, they have a relatively modest completion of 150 to 160 events of infections that are used to tally how well is the vaccine working, and also to monitor, importantly, the safety issues of the vaccines, because they could induce untoward immune reactions that we have to be knowing about. It could rarely occur, but we certainly have to know and anticipate that potential issue. So I'm looking at December, January as at least one or two of the trials being complete, and thus knowing that we have viable vaccines that are effective in suppressing infection. So that's but what I'm worried about is, here in the US, we're seeing things that companies are very motivated to win the race. We have our government using this in a highly political way to even affect the election that's coming in November 3rd. So we're seeing things that aren't good. that could interfere with the proper completion, the proper conduct of the trials.
Yeah, no, that's definitely quite a scary prospect to think about. And do you think that in a way, what would be the kind of tenets of good corporate behavior when there is obviously, a kind of legitimate interest from a corporate perspective to be able to kind of win that race? But at the same time, you want to make sure that there's the evidence behind it. How do you kind of reconcile those two?
Well, I think the vaccine is the exit strategy. And so we don't want to take shortcuts. We want to get this thing right. And as you can imagine, any one of these programs has a very big impact, repercussions on all the others, including even its own program as far as how you can keep giving people placebo over time. So, but the other thing is, there's hundreds of candidate vaccines. Some are going to be more powerful than the ones that the first ones to get out of the block. So we need a template of doing this right, taking time. Oftentimes we're talking about a matter of weeks, less than a couple of months. There's not a rush. We know how to keep this virus in check if we do the right things. And the vaccine is something that too much great things, the science, the efforts of the participants to join, not knowing that the vaccine would be safe, hundreds of millions of pounds or dollars that have gone into the trials each. Too much has gone in to spoil it by trying to rush it.
Yeah. And of course, I guess once we hopefully, knock on wood, will mark the date in the diary, which you said was December, gets a kind of vaccine, then there's the whole kind of logistics of distribution. And then how I guess, what are the main hurdles that you see around that, about being able to?
Well, yeah, this is another issue is, who are the people at most maximal risk, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you have the issue of healthcare workers, essential workers that, have to be in touch with a lot of people, and potentially for healthcare workers, people who might be infected. Because there's so many people who are without symptoms, and we've published on this, 30 to 40% of people don't know they have COVID-19, and they never manifest symptoms. They just don't know it. So that's why, picking the people who are most apt to be in contact with the so-called asymptomatic people, that's so important. It's vital. So the distribution, then there's also these issues of who is the most vulnerable, the aged. But we may not have enough data from aged people in the trial to know if they have the right dose, if they have the optimal response. We may have to do more trials in people, for example, over age 65. We also have issues with underrepresented minorities because they're underrepresented in the trials too. And so they may have a different immune response. We won't have any data for women who are pregnant. We'll have minimal data from certain studies on children and adolescents, but we need a lot more. So there's going to be holes in our knowledge base as to the distribution. And globally, there's issues about, middle and low income countries, and how will they get access to their people who obviously are quite vulnerable too. So there are all sorts of complexities with respect to distribution.
So it's quite interesting, that point that you raised around obviously lack of diversity in the populations that are part of the trial, which is obviously an issue that has been quite very well documented in healthcare, that obviously clinical trials do lack from that diversity in data. I'm wondering if, this might be a kind of $1 million question again to you, which is how come that things don't change? Like, why, if we know that this is obviously an issue that, underrepresented minorities are generally not part of clinical trials, why does that not kind of change the ethos or methodology that is used if you kind of continuously know that is going to be an issue?
Well, so what Pfizer did is they extended their trial from 30,000 to 44,000 to account for these issues, so that make sure that in the next 14,000, they do a better job of getting the elderly, getting the underrepresented minorities in. So that's an example of one way to do it. Another way to do it is to, change along the course of a trial to make sure you're getting a representative population. The problem we have is that when you do a trial of like these big mega trials, 10,000 plus qualifies as a mega trial. When you do these trials, the power of the study, that is the ability to make any definitive call, is based on the overall cohort of 30,000 or whatever the number is. And so the subgroups, that's the, let's say you're interested, well, did the people with diabetes do well? Did the people of this age group do well? There's not enough statistical power to say anything unless there's just some extraordinary evidence that's not anticipated. So this is one of the problems of interpreting the large trials. Is it's an overall sense. It's the entire cohort that drives a lot of the what you call definitive, unequivocal evidence.
And is there a role potentially also for, I guess, artificial intelligence in all of this and kind of changing the type of methods for trial, or absolutely not? And
oh, well, I think AI there's a lot of shots on goal for AI during the pandemic, but I don't think any of them have ever hit a goal yet. We've seen some good examples of AI for mining data, for even used, in the candidate vaccines and neutralizing antibody development, which is a potent way to interrupt the vaccine in illness progression or even preventatively. We've seen it in mining the literature. We've seen it for triaging people as to what risk category they're in and possibly keeping people at home safely, although we haven't seen really good validated algorithms. So there have been a number of AI efforts, like, for example, interpretation of CT lung scans to see whether it's high likelihood of COVID, and seeing things in a scan that might not be picked up by the radiologist. So I would say many efforts of AI, but I haven't seen one what I would call, really was making a difference, was really having impact yet. That doesn't mean it won't. And by the way, the things I talked about with respect to the multidimensional digital surveillance, things like, heart rate and the metrics of activity, mobility of people, and other layers, even electronic health records, that could, with analytics, prove to be one of AI's great contributions, because that's, high dimensional data, real-time sensors. It's a lot of data, and it requires, some hybrid models to interpret it, recurrent neural networks and deep neural networks to get to the answer. But, that could be a really big impact.
And so obviously part of the implementation of technology in the healthcare setting is also getting the staff and healthcare practitioners on board. And obviously I know that you are a firm believer in the fact that technology can really allow people to really focus on the more human side of medicine, which obviously you kind of wrote your latest book about, and you definitely get a sense of that in the Topol review. However, there's still quite a lot of discontent on the ground about, clunky technologies, bad electronic health record designs. People feel a bit scarred in the healthcare profession with, mishaps of tech in the past. Do you think that, all of these quite extraordinary trials and changes will really manage to, I guess, convince people on the ground to be able to kind of spread that innovation?
Well, first, just to say, participating in the review with the folks in the UK and NHS was one of the highlights in my whole career. I had the chance to work with 50 transdisciplinary experts, and they were just amazing people that were dedicated. All of us volunteered to do this, put in an enormous amount of work to map out the future of the workforce of NHS with the technologies that we've been discussing. And as you've alluded to, we were really keen about this gift of time. That is the humanity, restoring the human touch in medicine, which has been eroded. That is because there's so many things that have taken and dismantled the patient-doctor relationship, the patient-clinician relationship, that using AI to address things like getting rid of keyboards, liberation from keyboards, using natural language processing, machine learning from the voice, interaction. Getting the data from a patient all teed up, that is, without having to go through umpteen numbers of electronic screens and pages, so that it's basically all put together quickly through machine learning, that's the power of it. And getting patients empowered more so they can do a lot of the things autonomously, and anything from a skin rash or lesion to a urinary tract infection, an ear infection in a child. We already know we can have people make a diagnosis of a heart rhythm through their smartwatch. So a lot of things to shift to their capabilities, which again would decompress the work of clinicians, but also give more charge, more involvement, engagement of patients. So I think many things that can be done as we go forward, that AI can transform medicine and achieve what I'd call this deep medicine. Deep meaning especially not just deep learning, but deep empathy, deep connections restored between humans as machines get smarter.
Thanks, Eric. And really for the kind of final question, obviously there's quite a lot of anxiety, I'm guessing, amongst our viewers as well about, what's going to happen next. Are we going to have to be locked down again in the UK and stay inside longer than we potentially might want to? Definitely. So do you have any kind of projections for the immediate future?
Well, I think we will prevail in this pandemic. It may take a little while, but ultimately we'll get back to what we were like pre-COVID. So I'm always optimistic, and I haven't changed on that. I also think that if we don't lose our eye on the ball of AI, that it isn't just for streamlining things and getting more accuracy and efficiency, but rather the main goal should be the patient-clinician relationship. We can do this. We know there's so many ways that AI can help us get there. So if we give that overarching goal its due priority, we will make medicine better. It's a little bit of a back to the future story, because it used to be that way in the 1960s and 1970s before a lot of forces came into play. But we can get back there, and we can make it great as far as how we interact with patients, and the trust and the presence and the essence of medicine can be restored.
Well, Eric, thank you so much on that hopeful message. Thank you very much for this chat today. Really enjoyed it.
Thank you. Enjoyed it as well.
Want access to more CogX videos? Subscribe now for free at cogx.co.